Shalom Ubracha, Rabbi Manny to provide a Devar Torah on behalf of El Centro de Estudios Judíos Torah Temet for Perashat Shemot. You know, friends, I believe that Pharaoh was a communist or Marxist dictator. I know that sounds a little far-fetched to some people, but others who have had that experience of having to live under Marxism and statism and totalitarianism will understand exactly what I'm speaking about. I want to share it with you because my family are Cuban Jews who had to take refugee status in the United States from an oppressive system that has governed Cuba for far too long. And unfortunately, a similar situation has arisen in Venezuela and also in North Korea and also in China, where the governments are so oppressive that even any sign where the government sees that people have an opportunity to free themselves, they make the oppression even worse. That's exactly what Pharaoh did. When Moses presents himself for the first time in this week's Parashah, upon the command of God to Pharaoh, and says, "Let my people go," one of the most famous quotes in the Torah, Moses says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go so that they will serve me," says the Lord God. Of course, it wasn't just freedom for the sake of freedom, but really so that people would be able to be self-determinant, so that people would be able to have a direction for their families, a growth for themselves. And Pharaoh, of course, like every communist dictator in the world, says, "Who is that God? I don't even know who he is." Of course, he was claiming that he was the state, that he was the most powerful being, and that he doesn't have to recognize God. He doesn't have to recognize people's desire to live free and to be able to live the way that they want to believe in and to be able to live the things that they want to believe in. He's the state. And as Moses may carry out this mission, we see that Pharaoh makes it even more difficult for the Jewish people, who unfortunately, alas, had to find their own straw in order to be able to make their own bricks. That's exactly what happens today in North Korea. That's exactly what happens in Cuba. That's exactly what happens in Venezuela, where these oppressive governments create a situation where people have even a difficulty finding the simple, basic things that they need, as people become more and more desperate and have to work harder and harder to provide even the most basic necessities of toothpaste, of toilet paper, of basic hygiene, of basic things that are needed. They are so busy trying to scrounge around and find ways to find these things for themselves and for their families that, of course, they can't bring it together to create some sort of a rebellion. Interestingly enough, all of the statists, all of the dictatorships feel the same way. They believe that the citizenry should produce for the state, not vice versa, where the state is commanded to produce and to govern upon the consent of the governed. Moses, I believe, is the first revolutionary to say to all of these dictators and to say to all human beings all over the world that God, our Creator, wishes that we be free in order to be able to prosper ourselves and our families. Pharaoh responds with the traditional Marxist way of trying to make people feel guilty for progressing themselves and say, "Oh, you're a selfish person for trying to develop the comforts of your family." No, my friends. A person who wants to develop themselves and wants to develop the comfort of their family is not a selfish person. If an entire society seeks to advance themselves and seeks to advance the cause of their family, each and every one of those families uplifts the country and provides freedom and opportunity for other people. Of course, we have through Midrashic sources that Pharaoh had made it illegal for the Jews who were slaves to cry or to complain about their mistreatment. Of course, we see that today in Iran, and we see that today in North Korea, and all of those dictatorship countries where citizens are not even allowed to redress their complaints against the government. And of course, the Torah tells us that when Pharaoh died and a new Pharaoh arose, the people cried out to God, and God heard their crying. Says the Midrash, why did they wait? How come they cried when Pharaoh died? Why would they wait? Why would they cry? Wouldn't they be happy that Pharaoh had died? Well, finally it was permitted to cry out, and they took advantage, and they waited and they cried as if they were mourning for the loss of the Pharaoh, but they were really mourning for themselves. Recently, in the recent past, we saw the death of the dictator, of the terrible mass murderer, Fidel Castro of Cuba, destroyer of my parents' country. And people were seen in the streets, in the news, crying for the loss of Fidel Castro. I think that the same exact thing happened that happened in Egypt. When the Jewish people saw that the Pharaoh had died, they had longed so long. They had been dying to see the day when the Pharaoh would die. And when the Pharaoh died, and right away, another Pharaoh assumed the position and continued to oppress the people of Israel, their crying went up to God, and God knew what he needed to do to save us. Of course, the people of Cuba were crying at the death of Fidel Castro because even though they had longed for the day that that terrible, ruthless dictator would die, they knew that right away his brother, another ruthless dictator, would take his position. All totalitarian systems use the teachings of Pharaoh, and all of the revolutionary liberty movements use the message of Moses, our prophet, that God wishes human beings to be free to choose, that God wishes human beings to be free to exercise their rights, to seek out life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.